I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. One of the things I selfishly love about hosting this program is the never-ending stream of new information which reveals itself through the examination of a profession. Each job has its own idiosyncrasies, learning curves, and specialized knowledge. And to add, much of that varies pending a person's level of experience and accrued know-how. And without tuning the horn of this program too much, we do try to represent those at varied stages of their career. Why? Well, for one, there is value in hearing from people at all stages and ages. On today's show, we're going to be leaning into the world of marketing and advertising with a guest who's closer to the beginning of her career than the middle or end. That said, her insights on her profession as a marketing strategist, designer, and entrepreneur will be valuable to anyone with an interest in those specialities. Plus, her approaches and mental frameworks she uses to frame her career growth and development will be particularly helpful to those looking to level up their professional game. I'd love to get started and share, so let me more formally introduce her to you, and we can do this. Michelle Lyons is a UK-based designer and strategist specializing in Japan's travel market. As founder of the branding firm Point North, she helps brands and destinations to attract inbound and domestic tourists in Japan by uncovering their unique value, creating a competitive advantage, and crafting compelling brands. Now, in 2023, Michelle embarked on a mission to promote Japan's 34 national parks through a project named Parks in Japan. In response to the impact of uneven visitor distribution across the parks, Michelle plans to generate funding to support conservation efforts and local communities through the sale of fun park-inspired products. She's currently developing a series of collectible pins and patches under an educational adventure brand called Poketo and a trading card game called Parklander. Both are expected to launch on Kickstarter soon. Having been designing for almost 10 years and receiving a first-class honors degree in graphic design, Michelle is a highly experienced creative, but her love for Japan came more recently. After being introduced to Japanese culture by a friend around 2020, she felt entranced by the emotionally raw anime, deep respect for nature, quality craftsmanship, and the visually stimulating city streets. At the start of 2022, Michelle began studying the language with the goal of making Japan the main focus for Point North. Now, despite the challenges of establishing herself in this niche while living in the UK, Michelle has already signed clients including Atelier Japan, a luxury Japanese retail store, and Japan Sun, a consultancy with expertise in Japan's travel trade. Her networking efforts on LinkedIn have been instrumental to making those valued connections. So, with all of this noted, I'd like to welcome you to my conversation with Michelle Lyons. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Michelle?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I've been looking forward to this. You know, we'd lined this up quite some time ago. So yeah, like I said, I'm quite keen to share your story and your work with listeners. So speaking of which, I do have this first segment lined up, and it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just read off a definition of something related to what the guest does. And I went with this rather simplistic sort of definition, a catch-all, if you will. And I'd love for you to listen, of course, to it and then share your insights based off of your background in marketing strategy and design. So let me just read that off for you and we can go from there. Strategist. A strategist is a person with responsibility for the formulation and implementation of a strategy. Strategy generally involves setting goals, determining actions to achieve the goals, and mobilizing resources to execute the actions. A strategy describes how the end goals will be achieved by the means or resources. Again, very simplistic sort of look at this very broad topic, but based off of your experiences and your background, what would you say to that?
I think it's accurate, but I find that whenever strategy is defined, it can usually be in a way that makes it sound quite daunting. And it's kind of wordy and it sounds like, oh, only a strategist could do that. And I just think that it can really be simplified so much more. And the way I like to define it, which sort of follows my strategy process, is just what are we going to do? Why does it make sense? And how are we going to deliver on it? And I mean, that's literally the bare bones of a plan. And it's something that I would use in planning for my personal life in the same way I would use it for a business strategy. And I think also just knowing that it makes it seem a bit less intimidating.
Agree. That's a really good point. It makes it that much more approachable as well. I think within like business, we have this habit of dressing things up and making them sound a lot fancier than what they are. But I like how you just sort of broke it down into simpler terms. And quite honestly, that's all we really need at the end of the day here. And as it relates to you and your work, that's what I'm keen to dive into and hear more about. And of course, to share with listeners. Is there anything in particular with regards to that definition that you would really like to emphasize, like some parts that are really critically important as it relates to you and your work with branding and strategy when it comes to helping clients?
I would say the how part of a strategy is the most important because that's where all the action is. And without any action, there's really no point having a strategy. And it's so much better to even have a bad strategy that you can act on and get feedback from what happens rather than something that's just totally inactionable, if that's a word.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think that presents opportunities for like pivoting and moving and obviously like shifting out of, one strategy and into another based off of particular feedback, whether things are working, whether they're not. But yeah, okay. And one last question in regards to this. I mean, your definition or your view of this, is this something that's been evolving over time? I would guess like based off of experience and know-how and these different types of things, like getting into the work and what you started with and your views on it now versus, in the past. I'm sure things have changed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I sort of had to learn strategy from scratch. It's not something that was taught at university along with design or anything. So I've done all my learning about it through courses and books or just kind of observation of existing strategy. And I think, especially with brand strategy, which is sort of what I used to focus on, as opposed to strategy more broadly speaking, it's just filled with a lot of not very useful things that seem like they're really productive to be doing in a strategy workshop, like the sort of keywords that describe the brand personality and all these user profiles. And I just found that when I'd go through this brand strategy process for clients, and then I would also use it for my own brand, and I would find I was never looking at the document except for maybe a handful of pages. And I thought, there's a problem here because if I'm doing this for other people and even I'm not using it, then why is that? So that's when I started to realize that it's got to be something other than this. It can't be all this fluff that isn't useful. And over time, as I sort of read more books and it saw different angles on it, I realized that it is so overcomplicated and a good strategy really doesn't need to be. It should be something you could summarize in one line and anyone walking down the street could understand the idea.
That's a really good point. And I think also you raise a point in the sense of like ownership of an idea, like what it means to you and how you interpret it, and then how you kind of reshape it and represent it to the world in terms of like how you're working with clients. I think that's a really key point as well. Like, again, I think somebody who's new to any line of work, let alone the one that you're involved in, can get bogged down with some of the jargon. And like you said, a few times over, it can get almost intimidated by it. But if you can just sort of break it down into simpler terms there, and like I said, own it for what you think it means, based off of experiences, based off of chatting with others, and all sorts of things. I think that's where you can start to make some progress on your career, on your business. So speaking of which, this might be an opportune time to learn a little bit more about your business, Point North, and the work that you're involved in. Maybe you could share with listeners a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I focus on branding strategy and design for the Japanese travel market. So that could involve designing an identity, like the logo, the color palette, things like that for a brand. It could be more day-to-day design. So for example, I recently did some posters for some tours in Yokohama. So it could be like print design. And then the strategy is obviously what we've just spoken about. I would say I end up working more on design than strategy for clients, but that can be a challenge sometimes, because if it's a sort of A to Z building of a brand, you really need to start with strategy, because that lays the groundwork for the design, how that's all going to turn out. And then on the side, I'm working on the National Park project. So to promote the now 35 national parks, they've just announced a new one. And that's where it really kind of branches out in terms of what I'm actually doing, because I'm developing new skills, new knowledge, purely just to make this project happen. So, for example, I've had to learn game development from scratch. I've had to get really good at storytelling, learn character design, practice digital illustration. So I guess that's kind of the nature of a creative job. If you work for yourself, there's always going to be these self-initiated projects where it just diverges so much from the core services you would offer to a client. But at the same time, I think building this project on the side it's a demonstration of what I could do for a potential client. So obviously trying to establish myself in such a tight niche it's a big challenge, and it's definitely a sort of long-term commitment to build up, I guess, that reputation in this space. So I would say it's really crucial to be constantly working on these personal projects that show what these services might look like in action.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mentioned off the top, of course, but I mean, you yourself, you're based within London, correct? And you're focusing on, oh,
Manchester.
sorry, Manchester. Okay, in the UK, in the UK,
Yeah.
but you're focused on the Japanese market. So, I mean, like
Yeah.
you're doing this from afar, and like you said, you're trying to build your own brand in a sense, and reputation. So, yeah. And the second point that stands out to me in all of this and listening to it is like, being an entrepreneur, or being somebody who is involved in trying to establish their own business, you are wearing several different hats. And it sounds like to me, like all those different roles, responsibilities that you're holding right now, it does force you to skill up. And obviously there can be some stress and pressure associated with that. But then also too, I think degrees of fulfillment, that come along with this. Like once you are starting to get the hang of things, or master a particular skill, like that is where a lot of the work fulfillment comes in, at least from a lot of the guests who step onto this program and speak about all the different varied roles that they're involved in. So I would imagine that to be the same for you. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I've definitely found that ever since I began that project, which was I think over a year ago now, I really feel like I've started to enjoy my job. like I've been able to explore just completely freely any skill, any line of question, I can just really dig into it. And that's a freedom that you just wouldn't necessarily get with a client. So I think, yeah, definitely having that opportunity to problem solve constantly and build these new skills it's definitely really fulfilling.
Hmm. To add on to all of this, I do have this other segment, A Day in the Life. And I'm guessing here that your work, your workflow itself is quite varied, between working on projects for yourself and, things to showcase your own talents, but then also working on clients and then also probably prospecting, trying to get new clients. There's several different things you're involved with, but I think it'd be enlightening for listeners to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so about a year ago I actually had a coach who helped me to build a new workflow because previously I would just try to work kind of all day with no real structure to it. And I was just getting really burnt out and it wasn't sustainable. So, my new workflow, which has worked really well, is I'll start at 6:45 in the morning and I'll never do a task for longer than 45 minutes. So I'll usually start with kind of business stuff, which might be writing a new article for the website. It could be working on a service design, and then I'll do Japanese study for 20 minutes. Although this has kind of fallen by the wayside a bit lately, and now I've got about an 80-day Duolingo streak that wasn't supposed to happen.
Okay.
Um, and then I'll spend another 45 minutes on the national park project, and then I'll do LinkedIn stuff. So it could be connecting with new people, answering messages, sharing a post. Then I'll do some illustration practice for 20 minutes. And those sort of smaller chunks, they really help with the tasks that you kind of maybe find it hard to keep up. Like, I think if I had to do an hour of illustration, I would get really frustrated and I just wouldn't commit to it. And then I'll do another 45 minutes on the national park project. And in between these sort of short bursts of work, there'll be a few short breaks as well. But my working day will typically end sort of mid morning. So I compress all the structured work into the first half of the day. And that really helps me to be productive. And then the second half of the day, I can just sort of choose how I spend that. And that really works for my brain because I need that sort of combination of structure and flow because I'm both sort of logical and creative. It kind of just follows that. So, and then of course, if any client work comes along, that routine might go out the window a bit and I might spend the whole day on client work or a few hours, but it's generally quite routine. I'm usually sticking to that schedule.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I like it in the sense of, the effort towards one seeking out assistance initially, like recognizing that maybe what you had prior to that wasn't working for you in the best way. And then also the openness to try something different and reflecting on who you are as a person and trying to slot in, a time schedule or a way of structuring things that's going to work for you. Because I think a lot of people would just maybe just get stuck in the routine of what you were doing prior to, meeting with that coach and doing things that weren't maybe in your best interest or weren't leading to productive results, and I think just spending that little extra time or reflection on what works for you can really make a big difference. So I'm glad you shared that. I think that's really insightful and really helpful for young people to hear that. And also too, I mean, maybe we could step into this other segment of pathways one. I'd love to know about, your journey into this world. I mean, what got you initially attracted to, branding, design? Were these things that in your youth, when you were younger, you enjoyed? Like, I think in researching for you in your background, you've had an affinity towards illustration and perhaps drawing, but maybe you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was sort of really obvious ever since I was a child that I was creative and I was probably going to end up going down that path in one way or another. But up until sort of late high school, the only creative outlet I really had within the education system was art lessons. And I really enjoyed those, but I guess it sort of felt like something was missing a little bit. And it was towards the end of high school that I was finally introduced to graphic design. And I was like, oh, so it's like art with a purpose. So that was like really important to me because as much as I enjoyed sort of just drawing and creating things growing up, I wanted them to have a purpose, a sort of direction to them, some kind of use. And just making art for art's sake didn't kind of fulfill that. So, I mean, I would often be making things when I was growing up. I would find bits of card and I would save old pieces of packaging just to inspect the layout of it. And I just loved that whole process of sort of choosing the materials, matching all the textures and colors. I was like really meticulous with it. It had to be perfect. And so once I'd sort of discovered graphic design, that then came with me through college. I went on to study it at university. But weirdly, after spending all these years being really intent on having this graphic design career, I was feeling almost a little bit resentful of the industry by the end of university.
Huh, in what
And
way?
it was partly because I was really burnt out from, the coursework. And there was just this real there's a kind of pretentiousness in the design industry sometimes that I just really don't like. And I sort of just wanted to push it away. So, like, I really miss the days when it was a bit more rough. People would share their sketchbooks, the whole process, all the mess behind the final work. Nowadays, it usually feels very polished and everyone's kind of jumping on a trend. So it was at that point where, well, I'd actually started Point North at the end of university. So I didn't really know how to run a business at that point. I didn't really know where I was headed, but I started to get more into strategy after university, and that became then the outlet for the other half of my brain that really wants to dig into research and just investigate everything. And I suppose somewhere along the way, as I kind of recovered from the university days, that just blended really nicely with my interest in design and branding because obviously strategy is a really important part of that. So it all sort of just came together in the end. And I felt like I had that perfect balance of being creative, but being able to back it with logic and purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it highlights a really nice point there. And like a lot of people get hung up on the fact of, one, maybe not knowing what they want to do when they're, I don't know, like entering or trying to choose a program into university, or maybe once they are actually in a program where they want to go with things. And the way you sort of outline things is like you didn't necessarily know everything in terms of where you wanted to go with it. Ultimately, it was through some trial and error and finding out some things that you were enjoying, things that you were less enamored with, and that sort of like set new courses along the way. And again, I think it's just useful, insights for younger people who are struggling right now. And like, well, I don't know, I don't have the master plan. And the truth is, like, not too many people do. Again, speaking with a lot of people on this program, and your story kind of highlights that, I would say. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, I think I'd tried to plan it out so much because my final project in university was setting up this business. So I was kind of making a business plan and all this kind of thing. And none of it matters now. Like none of that plan happened. It all turned into something completely different. And I think I guess you've got to treat it more just as exploring the different pathways. Don't get too hung up on it being the one you've got to stick to. You can change at any moment. So just let it flow.
Yeah. I think that's sound advice. Speaking of which, this leads us into another segment here, Q&A discovery. And we've already spoken about this lightly already in terms of your interest in the Japanese market, in particular the Japanese travel market. I'd like to hear a little bit more about, what attracted you to, hyper specializing in the inbound and domestic market itself there.
Yeah, so I found that after trying out a few different sort of niches within Japanese culture, the travel market really hit on the experience design aspect, which is something that I really enjoy because I tend to design things sort of from feeling and intuition rather than, I guess, I don't know, a written list of criteria. And so creating experiences, it kind of comes back to how I used to make things as a child, where I was just thinking, how can I make this fun, or how can it be functional, and how can everything match and be really exciting. So the travel market, it just brings so many opportunities for that, not just in something like a tour experience, but the actual experience of a brand that's in that space or a destination. So, yeah, I think it finally felt like the right fit compared to the other niches I'd played with.
Okay. I mean, for listeners who aren't really familiar, the Japanese inbound market itself, like that whole area has just been exploding in the last, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, I would say. I mean, during COVID, there was certainly a lull, but before that, and even now, it's rebounding, quite mightily. And due to that, I would imagine that for somebody like yourself, that creates a lot of different opportunities because it's almost like being invented right before your eyes. So for a creative such as you, I mean, you have a chance. It's like a blank slate there. You have opportunities to really, engage with potential clients and maybe present brand new ways of engaging with target consumers, I suppose. So that must be exciting. I'm guessing as well. It must present some opportunities for you in a business like yours.
Yeah, I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. It's definitely been a case of I've kind of noticed a problem that I could address in the industry, and then I've found that, oh, they actually think this is really important as well. It really makes sense to focus on this. So, for example, reading their recent tourism strategy, they were mentioning the national parks a lot, and I realized, oh, this is like perfect timing. They're really wanting to ramp up their promotion of them. And yeah, there's definitely that opportunity to kind of bring those new ways of doing things into the industry, which I guess they might become more receptive to eventually. Obviously, it can be tricky when you're trying to help them from the outside, as I know in Japan they'll tend to go with someone who's obviously in the country or even in the company already. So yeah, hopefully I can make my way in if I really target the right problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And also too, I'm sure like with some of the clients that are, say, within the UK that are interested in expanding services into the Japanese market in some way, shape, or form, those types of companies would probably be after somebody such as yourself who, has built up some reservoir of knowledge and experience with the market and also is fully understanding, like, say, UK business standard strategies, ways of doing business. So I'm sure there's that avenue to explore as well. But yeah. This other question is that, one of the reasons that I was interested in speaking with you is I came across, you and your work on LinkedIn and, in terms of how you go about showcasing some of your talents, services, and insights. I think it really does come across quite strong, in terms of that presentation of it as well. And I think, again, returning to this point of young people and trying to establish themselves in their professional career, whether it's within, an industry such as yours or anywhere for that matter. What has been your approach in using a tool like LinkedIn to build brand awareness for you, for your company? What has been your strategy for that?
So at first, I tried all the sort of tips that were out there for content creation, time blocking, and content calendars, and content pillars, and all of this
All that stuff,
kind
yeah.
of thing. Yeah, and it didn't work. I couldn't stick with it for long enough. And so I ended up, like, once I'd started this national park project, especially, I would just start sharing updates about what I was working on. And I sort of like to think of this as progress marketing, like just documenting whatever it is you're working on at the time, keeping people in the loop. And I found that not only was that much more like a much more natural way to engage people and for me to post, I always had something that I could talk about because obviously it's an ongoing project and I can just literally take a picture of what I'm doing that day and say something about it. And so I would say, obviously, it's different for everyone. Some people really like to have structure with this, but I found just being really simplistic with it and thinking, what could I say today? What am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
It's just much easier. And it kind of reminds me, this is gonna sound like a weird tangent, but my mum said something the other day about how when she goes to the opticians, the sort of local opticians, they have this really kind of complex process for doing an eye test. And it's so granular and the questions are so specific that it makes it too difficult for them to be accurate. She can only give them a yes no answer to a really specific question. And she says they always end up getting the glasses wrong. And at a different opticians who have a much simpler process, they always get them right. And I realized it was kind of the same on LinkedIn, in that the more granular I've tried to be with the process and planning the content, the worse it gets. And that actually, the less you try, the better it is. So that's really how I would approach it. And then in terms of, I guess, making connections, like actually building a network, I suppose that's happened in a few different ways. So sometimes it'll just be that I've sent the connection request to someone, and that can be challenging sometimes when if it's people based in Japan, they're often not connections you're able to access yet. So it can take months of connecting with people before more people will open up. Um, but other times it's just the content I've been sharing has helped to attract people. And yeah, I guess there's different ways it can happen, but I sort of realized at some point that my growth on LinkedIn is never going to be huge like it is for these people who are offering maybe a more generic service, because I'm so niche that there's just simply not a wide enough pool of interest that I would have such a huge following. So I've always got to kind of keep that in mind. And then in terms of the algorithm, I know a lot of people like to keep up with how that's changing, but what I've found is that it gets worse and then it gets better and then it gets worse. And you can probably guess what happens next. And that's generally just how it goes. And so rather than trying to change how I operate every few weeks to fit the algorithm, I just keep posting through it no matter no matter how bad it gets or how great it gets. Sometimes the posts don't reach anyone, the engagement's terrible, and other times it's really good and I don't know why. And I think what really matters most is that you stay in the habit of talking to people no matter what the algorithm is doing.
I think a big part of it, at least this is my impression as well, is like the way you're posting, it's quite genuine in nature. I think, like you said, you're posting updates about what you're working on, and you can see obviously like the passion behind it and the work itself, and there's a certain level of quality attached to it, and I think that resonates as well. But speaking of the algorithms and whatnot, and like that's another good point. Like trying to keep up with that is a nightmare. Whereas, like I think I was just reading the other day on LinkedIn, like, and this just makes complete sense. And I think this would be like important, irregardless of whatever algorithm changes are occurring, is like that platform itself wants people to stay on the platform. They don't want people to be linking off to checking out a website or somewhere elsewhere. So if you're posting things about, say, what you're doing, and maybe there's different blurbs in there of how this can be helpful to, somebody else who is reading it, that's keeping people on that platform itself and keeping them reading and keeping them scrolling. So that unto itself sort of fits the platform. And then again, returning to this point of just like the genuine nature of what you're doing. And I think people generally want to see others succeed, and they enjoy, seeing the growth of people that they have some degree of respect for or interest in their services. So yeah, I think you're onto something there. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I do have another question in the segment here, which again is returning to Japanese market itself and being so tied to it now in terms of this niche. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about some of the unexpected surprises that you've encountered thus far, as well as, maybe some of the wins that you've experienced also early on.
Yeah, so I guess I was really surprised how many Japanese people are actually on LinkedIn because I always find that people say that it's not like a popular platform over there, and that I haven't found that to be true. There's so many Japanese people on the platform and many that have a big following. So in terms of being able to establish myself in this niche without being in the country, that's really opened the door up to opportunity. And I have been fortunate, obviously, to have calls with some of these people and get to know them more and kind of explore potential work in the future. So, yeah, I wouldn't believe everything you read about Japan in the news, obviously. And in terms of wins, I guess a lot of it really just keeps coming back to having been active on LinkedIn. Off the back of that, I got my first few clients that sort of related to Japan. So I got to do some design work in Atelier Japan, which is the Japanese retail store. And they sell all this really great luxury craftsmanship. So that was it. That was an interesting project. I was sort of crawling around on the floor doing inventory at the beginning and making spreadsheets. But then I also got to see the whole shop come together, be decorated, and do some design work, do the social campaign. And I've also got to speak at a local Japanese festival. So I spoke about branding in Japan there. And again, that's come through people that I've connected with on the platform. So I would say those were the wins. But yeah, there's always the challenge of it's gonna be difficult not being in Japan and not being fluent in the language. That's the two things I get told on nearly every call with someone in Japan. Those things need to happen. eventually.
Yeah, probably some sage advice there that you're receiving. Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. But I guess, I mean, half the battle is recognizing that, and then certainly taking some steps towards that. And it sounds like to me those are things that you are, focusing on, and
Yeah.
understand that you do need to begin addressing. So yeah, okay, all right. Well, maybe you could shift into this middle segment of water cooler story, and I'd love to hear, a story related to you and your work.
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, I was trying to solve this problem of attracting sort of tourism boards in Japan. So, especially for this national park project, I was trying to think, how can I get their attention? They're these big organizations, a lot of people that don't even speak English. So, how on earth am I supposed to reach
It's
them?
quite the question.
And yeah, so I've been reading a book recently called Invisible Solutions, which it's been really helpful for reframing sort of problem statements. And one of the lenses it suggests is, what else is this like? So, what's a kind of similar problem to this, and how was it solved? And it got me thinking about a girl I'm connected with on LinkedIn called Naila, who runs a blog called The Navigatio. I might be saying that wrong, but it's a blog about Japan travel, and she's been really successful with it. But she's had these partnerships with exactly the kind of organizations that I'm looking to attract. So I was thinking, oh, what could I learn from how she's done it? And maybe the blog is the key. Maybe I need to get back on top of creating content on there. And then within 30 minutes of kind of having this thought, I had a message from her,
Oh, no way.
and she said, "Oh, I didn't know you were based in Manchester as well. We should meet up and have a chat sometime." And I was like, "Did I just make that happen?"
Yeah.
I was like looking at my drink, like, "What's in this stuff?"
Yeah.
And I just thought it was so weird. And then within an hour of kind of going through this process of like, oh, how can I get some attention on this? I had another message from an editor at a media company called Skift, which sort of specializes in the travel industry. And I was asked to answer some questions about a sort of pricing model they're implemented in Japan for tourists. And I was like, oh wow, some publicity has just appeared. And it was just a really bizarre day that these things had almost manifested themselves. But I thought it was such a good kind of demonstration of, I guess, my perspective on the world, in that everything that you want to achieve is sort of downstream of your beliefs, because your beliefs are the lens through which you'll filter everything, and that will determine how you think and feel, which will determine how you behave, the actions you take, and to a large degree, it will determine the results that you get. And although in scenarios like these, it can feel like it was just pure luck, you can usually trace it back to something you've done. And it's more that I've been taking the actions that have sort of created those conditions for luck and opportunity to arise. And I thought, well, if I wasn't talking so much on LinkedIn, I would never have met these people. They wouldn't have found me. They wouldn't know what I do. So yeah, I think if you want to create luck for yourself, you've got to do the work, actually.
I love that. I love that story. I buy into that 100%. I believe the exact same thing. I think, it can come across as serendipity, but I think what you were just speaking of just a second ago is the truth. I mean, you position yourself for those types of things to occur, and you never fully know what this collection of small actions can amount to day in, day out. We were speaking earlier, in terms of your daily routine, and you taking those 45 minutes every day or whatever it might be, and creating that content, that genuine content for LinkedIn, and what again that amounts to. And here we go in one day. I mean, that is pretty pretty interesting how a couple of those things came together on that particular day, but all the same, like you said, I mean, you're positioning yourself for these things to potentially occur. And it's like you said, all about taking action, and consistent action. I would probably like to add in there. So yeah, I really like that story. It's an inspirational one, and I think it's a solid message for listeners who are keen to pursue something, but maybe aren't sticking to it necessarily in the way that they should be. We are moving along at a pretty good pace, and we're rounding then this last segment, a crystal ball segment, and it is as it sounds. I mean, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And in the segment, typically we're looking at technology, and obviously right now it's AI. Everyone's talking about AI. And returning to you and your work, whether it's design, whether it's strategy, whether it's the branding side of things, that is an area right now that a lot of people are, talking about AI. Like, to what degree is it going to come in and take over? There's some fear on that side of things. And there's like a lot of pushback where people are saying like, well, no, AI is not going to be able to do this, this, and this within this realm. But from somebody like yourself, what would you say to all of this? What is your feeling on technology and AI in the space that you live within?
I think that, especially for designers, AI is obviously gonna start creeping in more and more into what would have been their jobs. And I think that although I guess it can seem like it's this scary thing, but it's not useful to be afraid of it, because it will just put you in the wrong headspace to kind of approach it like solving a problem. So I think it's really important to look at what's more out of reach from AI, what's the kind of more long lasting things you can do. And I guess that's partly why I'm putting so much into this national park project, is that it's solving real world problems, and it's doing it in such a way that AI wouldn't be able to kind of come up with this complex web of ideas that have all fed into it. And so, although I guess the creative part, the design part, could be taken over by AI eventually, I think you've really got to try and ground yourself in those real world things, and certainly don't specialize in digital marketing or something where I don't know, you're marketing something else that only exists on the internet. But at the same time, I was very resistant to it at first. I just had no interest in using AI because it takes away the fulfilling part of what I do, which is thinking and creating. So it's sort of like, even though I could make it easier or quicker, that's not really the point. I want to do it myself.
Yeah.
And so I did eventually start testing it out with Google's sort of chatbot Gemini, only because I couldn't get ChatGPT to work. So I've been using that throughout the project for research mainly. And it's definitely helped to speed that up, to not have to manually try and find what I'm looking for. But also, because I'm doing this kind of huge complex thing entirely alone, I've used it sort of as a almost person to bounce my ideas off. So yeah, I'll just type in what I've come up with and say, what do you think? And it'll just give me like a pat on the back or say, maybe consider this. And it's been really useful for that, just to feel like I almost have someone on the team. But creatively, it's been terrible. If I've ever asked it to come up with an idea, it's so bad. And it's kind of like the equivalent of a person telling you the first idea that came into their head and then telling that to you over and over again. So it just it doesn't understand like creative depth. I just can't get it to grasp anything that I describe to it. So I think in that sense, although AI, there's other programs that can design things, the actual ideas part, I think, should be left to humans because they're better at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think like it's a training model unto itself, right? So it's drawing on all this past information and whatnot. But when you're creating something completely new and you're considering what client needs are and whatnot, like you have all the information. And no matter how you feed that into the system and try to like explain it, it's going to interpret it in its own way, right? So yeah, I get what you're saying there, and it's going to come across as incomplete in a sense. And the premium truly is on the creativity and whatnot, and understanding the actual needs of what a client is after, and that probably is still going to fall largely on humans, right? But I also like that idea though of using AI in that sense of as a partner of like exchanging an idea, and then like maybe whatever it does come back, it presents something to you in a different way and it strikes an idea in your mind that like, okay, I can go off in this direction now. It just gives you a different point to consider. You're not necessarily using it to come up with the idea, but you're drawing on some abstract thing that it's presenting and that might spark another idea. So yeah, it's what's interesting right now. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out, the rules of engagement, across industries, and how do we use it as a tool? What do we use it for? What don't we use it for? What is it good at? What isn't it good at? And it sounds like to me that's the case for you, at least for the moment right now in the space that you're operating within. So yeah. But I've got to say here, Michelle, we've blown through this conversation. I can't believe we're approaching the end here. And I know that listeners are absolutely going to love all that you've shared today. And I know I certainly did. And as I mentioned off the top, I'll have links to you and your work within the show notes. So for those who are interested in following along Michelle and what she's doing, you can find her on LinkedIn and elsewhere. But thanks again, though, for taking some time today.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Michelle and her work, you can do so via her company website, pointnorthbrandco.com. You can also find her on LinkedIn and Instagram. And for reference, I will have links for all of those in the show notes. And hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share. To show further support, you can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And then lastly, head on over to YouTube. As I mentioned off the top, I do have that channel over there, which hosts highlights from these audio conversations. And if you do make it over there, I would love that like or subscribe. Now, finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as A, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.